Good evening, everyone. Oh, we got to do better than that. Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you again to the Columbia Museum of Art for this groundbreaking exhibition. Remix is a really fantastic exhibition. I'm really honored and proud to be a part of it. And as one of the artists who is featured in the exhibition, it really feels good to be able to come home in a sense. This is really a really great opportunity to return to the state, and to be able to participate in something that's so meaningful to so many people. So I'm really appreciative to the staff and the team who put the exhibition together, and thank you. So I just want to ask y'all to help me warm the room up a little bit and just give a hand for the Columbia Museum of Art for this exhibition, because it's really fantastic. But as you've heard, my work has taken me around the world, from Atlanta to Paris, New York to Cape Town, and many places in between, including major network television shows. My work is featured on shows like Fox's Empire and Blackish on ABC. And I've had some really wonderful and amazing experiences as an artist. But I thought tonight for this presentation, instead of talking about where I am right now, we'll get to that. I thought I'd take you guys on a little trip behind the canvas, and tell you a little bit about how I got here, if that's all right with you. All right, let's do it then. So what if I told you that it wasn't a trip to a museum that initiated my dreams of becoming an artist, but instead it was an encyclopedia, a really old World Book encyclopedia from the year 1969. And some of you may know this, but or you've just heard, actually, that I grew up not far from here in Hartsville, South Carolina, and I was educated in the Darlington County Public Schools. I moved to Hartsville around the age of 5 after losing both of my parents tragically, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But growing up, we didn't have a lot of things. We didn't have a lot of money, and there were no galleries or museums in Hartsville to go to, which didn't really matter much because we also didn't have a car, so that wasn't a big deal. But however, we did have a TV, and I spent many, many hours in front of that television watching cartoons. And back in those days, cartoons were a lot less sophisticated. So, it was nothing for Fred Flintstone or Bugs Bunny to stand still on screen for a few minutes, and I would do my best to try to draw them, before they would move again. As a result, I learned to draw really fast. But I began drawing these characters on the pages and covers of my notebooks, and eventually my friends at school would ask me to draw the characters on their books, and I really loved the attention that I got from my friends and from teachers. And at some point, I decided that I wanted to be an artist. That was something that I saw myself doing. But everybody around me said that I would have to either starve or die, before I got any recognition. And you see me now, so I was already pretty skinny, and being a starving artist sounded pretty terrible, so I didn't want to do that. But one day in the 4th grade, we read a segment in our reading section about Charles Schulz. And you guys know Charles Schulz of Peanuts fame. His bio said that Charles Schulz was an animator. Now, at this point, I figured I probably logged like 1 million hours in front of that television drawing cartoons, but I never thought about the people who made them. And so after reading this story about Charles Schulz, I became really curious. I was intrigued. So in addition to that TV, like I said, we had this set of World Book encyclopedias from 1969. And, being poor, they were also the only books that we had in the house. So I spent just as much time reading those encyclopedias as I did watching television. In fact, before I imagined myself becoming an artist, the first thing I ever really wanted to be was in the encyclopedia. I used to imagine people looking up Pecou, Fahamu, in the encyclopedia one day. But after reading about Charles Schulz, I raced home that day and I grabbed the A encyclopedia. I looked up animator, and it said C cartoonist. So I scrambled, I found the C encyclopedia, I looked up cartoonists, and I read everything it said about cartoons, about the history of cartoons, about how they were made, about the people who made them. But one passage in that book stood out to me. It read that a cartoonist could make up to $1,000 a week. So I began to do some rudimentary math in my 9-year-old mind. And I started thinking, if they were making $1,000 a week in 1969. They have to be making a lot more now. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a cartoon animator. And from that point on, I fully immersed and threw myself into becoming a cartoon animator. Anybody who grew up with me will tell you that by the time I was in middle school, I had my own company name. I was doing my own comic books. I had my own characters. My business was going to be called Mootoons, and I would tell you without hesitation that I was going to be the Black Walt Disney. I took my cartoonist aspirations quite seriously, and I even had set benchmark career goals by the time I got to high school. You know, I planned to graduate and go to work for Walt Disney and learn the trade, and within 10 years of graduation, I would launch Mootoon Studios, but life had different plans. So as I began to apply for colleges, you know, I figured that a lawyer would go to law school, a doctor goes to medical school. I want to be an artist, I'm going to art school. And I discovered that in Atlanta, the Art Institute of Atlanta offered a program in animation. And so I decided that that's where I was going to go. But before I could apply, I was visited by a recruiter from the Atlanta College of Art who encouraged me to apply there. He explained that I would be exposed to the fine arts and that my options would be much broader. And at that time, that phrase, fine art, just really went over my head. He also explained that the Art Institute only offered an associate's degree, and that at ACA, I could earn a bachelor's degree, which held more weight. Plus, he offered me a scholarship. And as fate would have it, the first words I heard on my first day of class proved to be transformative. After taking the attendance, the professor approached the board and wrote, "What is art?" People began to raise their hand and offer their thoughts and ideas, but I sat silently because as much as I spent time drawing and thought of myself as an artist, I just simply did not have an answer. I didn't know what to say to that. And that question stayed with me like one of those cartoon bubbles, that cartoon clouds that follow you around everywhere. It followed me when I did my first digital animations. It followed me when one of my best friends, you know, told me one night, you know, those cartoons you're drawing are cute and everything, but come with me to this museum, or come with me to this gallery opening. And a painter herself, she began teaching me about different artists and the themes in their work. She introduced me to a world of art that I had never known before, and she encouraged me to make my first paintings. That cloud was still with me when I changed my major from animation to painting, and when I arrived at Spelman College to study under my mentor, Dr. Arturo Lindsay. And Dr. Lindsay kind of picked up where my friend left off, challenging the way I thought about myself, thought about my work. He pushed me to go deeper, to be more thorough and consistent with my craftsmanship. He tried to make me be not just a better artist, but a better me. He would always say, there's no such thing as luck. You have to be prepared when your opportunities arise. And that cloud was still with me as I sat there in my dorm room one night in my junior year. And I happened to be listening to a new CD that I just bought called Soul Food by group Goody Mob. Anybody familiar with that album? It's a really fantastic album. As the album played, one particular song reached in and shook me to my core. The track was called Guess Who? And it featured the 4 members of the group Goody Mob rapping about the impact of their mother's love. So that song played as I sat there in my room, and like I said, it grabbed me. Like I hit the repeat button, and I played it again, and then I hit it again. And as that song continued to play on repeat, my hands started to move. And when it was all said and done, I had transformed this wooden cement mold that I had scavenged from a construction site into what I called a spirit box. I was inspired by the African art I had been studying in school, and specifically the African Minkisi, which are these votive figures that are often created to honor deceased loved ones or to protect the homes from negative energies. But I created my own version of this Nkisi, dedicated to my own mother. And I couldn't articulate the why or even how, but from that point I felt really compelled to tell a story that I hadn't really talked about since I was 5 years old, that of the night that my mother died. So, fueled by the work that I created, and with Guess Who on repeat in my mind, I approached my siblings and asked them what they remembered from the night that our mother died. Because in the more than 16 years since her death, my brother and sisters and I had never spoken to anyone, or really even each other, about what we saw that night. And I questioned my own memories, not certain if they were genuine or if I had composited them from things that I had seen or read over the years. You see, in 1980, when I was 4 years old, my father, who was diagnosed schizophrenic, murdered my mom while me and my siblings sat in the next room. He then marched us out to the street on this cold January night to the local police station where he turned himself in, and we were left wards of the state. And this memory had haunted me like pretty much all my life. And after interviewing my siblings and discovering that we all shared a pretty similar recollection, I used their stories in my own to begin to create this body of work that I called Life After Death. And this body of work became my senior exhibition. And as the exhibition approached, of course, I was required to write an artist statement to talk about what this work was about, but I didn't have the words for it still. I was really challenged to explain why I was doing something that was so personal and so intimate. But the night of the exhibition, things kind of came together for me. That night, when the doors opened, people walked in, and I watched, faculty and friends and family and professors fall to pieces. They broke down in tears, and many people were moved to come and tell me that they admired my strength and courage and resilience. Some people were so moved that they felt that what I had created gave them the courage to go and deal with some past trauma of their own. And I was really overwhelmed by the response. I hadn't anticipated it. I didn't expect that to be the response. But standing there watching those reactions, the cloud that had been following me all those years began to dissipate. And I recognized that that experience showed me what the power of art could be. And I decided in that moment, right then and there, that I never wanted to make pretty pictures, that I wanted to make art that could do something, that could move people and heal people and shape and change the world. And that's really how my inspiration to become an artist really took shape and took form. Now, after graduating from college, of course I had to get a job, and you can't go in some place and say, hey, I'm a painter, hire me. You need some kind of skill. So I lied. I said that I knew how to do graphic design. I knew nothing about graphic design whatsoever. But in my previous semesters doing animation, I had acquired some skills using a computer, and so I began to, study magazines and look at cool ads and album covers and things that I thought were visually appealing, and I would do my best to recreate them. And I taught myself to become a graphic designer. And I got this job, excuse me, and I worked there for a few months before moving back to New York and landing a job working for this boutique design company that did a lot of the collateral for small hip-hop labels and restaurants and businesses, things of that nature. And it was a really great opportunity for me because I actually got to sit next to a virtual who's who of New York rappers in the late 90s. And if you guys know anything about hip-hop, you know that that was kind of like the apex of hip-hop, especially in New York. And one of the great things that happened was that sitting there, I got to see a completely different side of the many artists that we saw. The person who came in and sat next to me to kind of guide me as I was creating this collateral was completely different from the personas that they portrayed in these advertisements. And I just remember thinking, man, that's really fascinating. I wonder what would happen if somebody promoted an artist the same way we do rappers. And so I just kind of filed that in the back of my mind. And after about a year and a half, I moved back to Atlanta, and I decided to start my own design agency. And again, I had very similar clients, small businesses, hip-hop labels, nightclubs, things of that nature. But one of my first major clients was then mayoral candidate Shirley Franklin, who ultimately became the first female mayor of the city of Atlanta. And while designing Shirley's materials, we would always have to include this line that said, paid for by the committee to make Shirley Franklin mayor of Atlanta. I just thought that was kind of ridiculous because her staff was like adamant that that line appeared on everything. They were actually quite neurotic, about including that line. And I remember thinking as a joke, I need my own committee, So after, doing this for a while, and mind you, all this time I'm still making paintings and making artwork and growing increasingly frustrated because I was doing all the things that I had been taught in school. I would make my work, I would take slides, I would send packages to galleries, and wait to get that call or that letter back inviting me to do a show. I never got that call and I never got that letter, and I was, becoming really disheartened in the process. But one day as a joke, I decided that I would actually form my own committee. And, and then I also retrieved that idea that I had from many years before about marketing, myself as an artist the way we would market hip-hop artists. And again, I'm creating every day all of this collateral to promote all these rap artists and, seeing them be, ultimately successful from these efforts. I decided that I would do something similar. And the idea was really kind of sparked by the promotional campaign for 50 Cent for his first album. Does anybody remember that, when 50 Cent first came out? This was the most ubiquitous ad campaign I have ever seen in my life. He was everywhere. If you went to the grocery store, there was a 50 Cent ad on the cereal box. If you were driving down the street, he was on a billboard. He was on the back of your church fan. He was everywhere you looked. And I just thought that was really amazing. So I decided that I was going to create a marketing campaign for myself mirroring the 50 Cent campaign. So I asked a friend of mine to take a photo of me in my toughest 50 Cent style pose, and I crafted this campaign called Fahamu Pecou is the shit. And at first it was, it was part joke, it was part frustration, but in a large part, it was an experiment. I really just wanted to see what would happen. Like, what would people, say if I did this? And so I, designed this image as you see here. This is the original art. I printed up a few large posters, and I would go around the city of Atlanta wheat pasting these on buildings all over the place. And it was an instant hit. I mean, immediately people were coming up to me, mostly with concern. Fahamu, I saw some sign that said you was shit. Are you in trouble? Anything going on? But I recognized that it was working, that it caught people's attention, and so I continued to kind of push the envelope and try different things. In fact, I take credit for being one of the first people to start a social media campaign, because I used to troll a website called MySpace. Anybody remember MySpace? But I would find really horrible, whack pictures of people and do a compare contrast. So, not the shit, Fahamu Pecou is the shit, and then I would blast these images all over MySpace. And, people will start, I started growing followers, and, people wanted to know more. Who's Fahamu? What is he doing? Like, what is this about? Is he a rapper? Like, what's going on? I would do all kind of crazy things. I would throw parties, I once threw a party called Official Shit, where it didn't say anything about what was going on. It just literally said, Fahamu Pecou presents Official Shit on this day at this time. And I remember the night of the event, sitting at the bar, and a guy comes up, and he's like, hey, man, you know who this Faham, you know who this dude is? And I was like, nah, man, I don't know. He's like, is he gonna rap or something? I was like, I don't know what's going on. But right around midnight, the lights came up on the stage, and I had an easel and a canvas set up, and I stepped up on stage, and I just started painting. And my friend who's the DJ started playing music, and people got up and started dancing, and it just turned into a big party, and that was the whole event. But we would continue to do, all kinds of experimental things like this. Just trying to see what would happen, what would be the result of this kind of activity. As I said before, I learned to do graphic design by studying magazines, and so in the process, I became a really avid collector of magazines, and I would make, at least once a week, I would go to bookstores and newsstands and just buy random magazines. And one day on one of those trips, one of those annoying subscription cards fell out. And I remember picking it up, and there was somebody on the cover of this magazine that I'd never heard of before, and I thought to myself, when you see somebody on the cover of a magazine, you automatically think they must be somebody important. They're on the cover of a magazine, right? So I should be on the cover of a magazine. So I made one up. And I called it Contemporaneo. And I said that I designed a subscription card around it and said that if you fill this card out and mail it back in, you'll get a free issue of Contemporaneo. And I went back to the bookstores, and I stuffed these cards in the magazines all up and down the newsstand. And they came back in droves. They came back by the dozens. And to this day, I'm sure there's some people who are really, really dissatisfied with the quality of service at Contemporáneo because they never got their magazines. But one day after retrieving a stack of these cards from my mailbox and looking at the image of this fake magazine that I created, I was like, I kind of like this image. It looks cool. I should paint this. And so I did. And it was like fireworks went off. All of a sudden, it all made sense to me. And I realized that this magazine trope was a great way for me to combine a lot of my interests and ideas. But it also allowed me a really rich platform from which to offer up my observations about the world. And given the lack of visibility for Black people, and especially Black men in artists in the fine art world at the time, I decided it would be a really interesting juxtaposition to put my character and all his like hip hop bravado and attitude and swag on the covers of art magazines. Like, what would be a more, what would be a bigger contradiction? And so I set myself out to paint myself on the cover of every art magazine imaginable. And so over the years, I did something close to 200 different art magazines with myself on the cover, with this one being the only one that's not a real magazine. And it was really funny because very quickly after doing that, magazines actually started calling me or emailing me and asking me to paint myself on their cover. But what I was doing when with these works was making these kind of critical observations about the excessiveness of hip hop culture, satirizing celebrity culture, talking about the performance of Black masculinity, the dearth of Black artists within the context of fine art world. Many, many different ideas and themes were coming up in this work. And so I'm going to go through a few of these images kind of briefly, and I know you guys may have some questions and things like that, so I'm happy to go back at any point, but I'll just kind of point out some of the highlights of these works. But these early magazine paintings were called neo-pop. And this was, again, still a little bit of an experiment. It was an extension of what I had been doing with the Fahamu Pecou is the Shit campaign. And this character, Fahamu Pecou is the Shit, had literally come to life at this point. And so I would stage photo shoots where I was trying my best to recreate, the kind of glossy look and feel that you would see on a magazine cover, but the images would actually be subversive so that, they're designed to be real poppy and slick to pull you in, but once you got in, the messaging would be something completely different than what you expected when you saw it. So, for example, on the left, this piece, One Day It'll All Make Sense, is an example of the ways in which I began playing with language and playing with words in these paintings. So I would mine like hip hop lyrics and hip hop songs and find like little clever sayings and turns of phrases and use those as titles or use those as themes to expand into this visual vocabulary. For example, on the piece on the right, Superficial, I was working on this piece. I didn't have a title for it. I just really kind of liked the image. And I was listening to Kanye West's album, Late Registration. And he had a line in one of his songs where he said, "Damn, Kanye, it'd be stupid to dish you. Even your superficial raps are super official." And I thought that was really clever. And so I called the piece Superficial. Another one of these kinds of works is this piece on the left, and it ain't even February. And so this, this came out of a conversation that I was having with a friend because we were literally invited to be in a show for Black History Month, and she was like, "Oh, here they go again. Every February they want to come and get, a bunch of Black people to do an art show." And, I was making a commentary on the fact that, I'm making work beyond the month of February. Y'all should still check for me. And on the right, the blow up, excuse me, this photograph was taken at the opening for my first exhibition. And I want to kind of dip back in the story just a little bit. I talked about the fact that the character that I created had begun to come to life. There was an opportunity to be a part of a group exhibition in Atlanta in the spring of 2005. And I was invited to be in the show. But days before the show was supposed to open, I was uninvited to be in the show. And I was really, annoyed by this. The organizers of the show had basically overpromised and could not produce what they said that they could do. and they found out that they had to kind of cut back on some of the things that they promised. And that meant some of the artists who were invited to be in the show could not be in the show. I did not take too kindly to being one of the artists who was asked not to be in the show, and so it turned into a big deal, but ultimately they decided that I could be in the show. But by that point, I was so pissed off, I was like, well, not only am I gonna be in the show, I'm gonna take over the show. So this event was actually at the High Museum of Art. It was an event they were doing for their college night, and it was a huge event. There was, when the event opened, or the day before the event opened, I invited several of my friends to wear, you know, their Fahamu Pecou's and shit shirts, and I gave out a bunch of shirts and asked people to wear them so we can make a scene. But I also hired a professional bodyguard, and I asked one of my girlfriends to be my date for the evening. And so the night of the event, there's a line outside of the High Museum, down the block, around the corner. I mean, it's ridiculous. You can't even drive up to the building. And we pulled up in a town car. I had made arrangements with some of the security at the museum to get us in ahead of the crowd, and they came and met us at the town car and walked us, you know, real ceremoniously along the line. And everybody's looking like, hey, who's that? Like, what's going on? And, my bodyguard, his name is Big Daddy. He's literally about 7 feet tall. And when he spoke, it sounded like he was talking from the core of the earth. Hello, my name is Big Daddy. You know, he was a really big dude, and he had on dark glasses. I had on dark glasses. He had on a big trench coat, and Honey is just wearing a little short skirt, and she's looking all fly. And they walk us into the High Museum, and everybody's like turning around, looking like, what's going on? Who's this? And, you know, friends of mine, people who I've known for many, many years are running up to me like, Fahamu, we love your work. And Big Daddy will push them back like, excuse me, Mr. Pecou is not taking any interviews tonight. If you need to speak to him, here's his card, you know. And it ended up being a huge scene. Like, I literally, for the entire night, did not open my mouth. I didn't say anything to anybody. Big Daddy was either pushing people away or Honey was kind of schmoozing like, oh yeah, what Fahamu's saying in this work is blah, blah, blah. And so the following day, there was an article in the paper about this event, and there was about a paragraph, you know, about the event and how, crazy it was. But the rest of the article was talking about me walking around with this bodyguard and throwing shade to everybody. And that ended up being like this kind of legendary thing, and it actually sparked, you know, the performative aspect of my work. Where I would actually show up at my openings with bodyguards and big entourages of people and, you know, just do really kind of outlandish, crazy things. Once in New York for one of my openings, I rented a limousine and stuffed about 20 people in it. And people are dressed in all kind of costumes and stuff like that. And when we pulled up in front of the gallery, it was like a clown car. Like, people are just like tumbling out of the limousine, some on roller skates. My nephew had on a gorilla costume and carrying a little Empire State Building. It was, really ridiculous stuff. But this photo, that was a long way to tell the story about this photo, but this photo that you see on the cover of the Blow Up magazine was taken at my opening for my very first solo show in Atlanta, where we had a red carpet. And you see me with Big Daddy in the background and my date for the evening walking the red carpet. And so we would do these kinds of things to stage these kind of experiences for people. And I would often call them anti-performances, because it was a lot less about what I was doing and more so about people's reactions to me. So other works in the Neopop series also include this piece, I Ain't Been Shot a Whole Bunch of Times, which is a reference to a line from one of Jay-Z's songs. And on the right is another piece, Fresh As I'm Is. So in addition to painting, I also do work in a lot of other mediums. My work extends, as I said, to performance, but also into media. So I privilege the medium based on the concept. So as opposed to thinking that paint is the only way that I can express myself, I generally land on what the idea is first and then try to think of what's the best way to express this idea. So sometimes that manifests as a painting, sometimes it's a drawing, sometimes it's a music video, sometimes it's a song, sometimes it's all of those things. But it allows me to connect with audiences on multiple levels, which I think is really important, especially because of the nature of the work that I'm doing. and because of the audience that I'm specifically targeting with these works. So my work is really geared around a conversation with young African-American males. And, you guys go to a lot of museums and galleries. You don't see a lot of young African-American males in those spaces. And so as I'm creating this kinds of work, I'm often thinking of how can I connect to this audience in a meaningful way. I'm thinking access, and accessibility, and creating work that privileges accessibility through a variety of mediums. And so if the painting won't hook you, maybe the song will, and then you'll connect. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. I don't have a slide of the work that's featured in the Remix exhibition because you guys can, make a left outside the door and see it in person. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that series, which was a body of work that I completed around 2010, 2011 called Art History Next, where I began to appropriate famous self-portraits from throughout art history and put myself in as a way of changing the context and changing the conversation, remixing these portraits. And so on the left is a piece, None of My Heroes, which is inspired by Barkley Hendricks' icon from My Man Superman. And in that piece, you see Barkley Hendricks is wearing like a Superman t-shirt, but he's making a commentary about the fact that superheroes are often not a consideration in Black communities. Like superheroes, too fantastical of an idea for us to think about. And so my work is kind of playing off of that. And on the right is a piece called The Treachery of Media Images, which is after Rene Magritte's The Treachery of Images, which you guys may be familiar with. It's a picture of a pipe, and it says, Ceci n'est pas un pipe. But mine says, Ceci n'est pas Fahamu. But it's a play again on that idea of the way images can be deceiving and deceitful. But this, the work that you see, the Rockwell piece, was a part of that body of work where I was playing with those ideas and remixing famous works from art history. And so to kind of bring us up to speed on where I am now, around 2010, I really began to focus more specifically on the challenges that directly impact Black masculinity, and primarily in terms of the way Black males see themselves and how this seeing informs their performance of their identity, their personality, and even the way they socialize. So some of you may be familiar with a psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan, and he has this theory that I really work with a lot, I play around with a lot, called the mirror stage, where he talks about the way identity is formed and the ego is shaped. And he basically equates this to an infant seeing themselves reflected in a mirror, right? And so prior to seeing their reflected self, they don't really have a full concept of who they are and how they function in the world. And so seeing themselves reflected, they begin to shape their identity based on that reflection. And so this is something that a lot of psychologists and sociologists have worked with over the years, and really begin to equate to the way the media works to dictate how people see themselves and how people's identities take shape based on media images. And I work with this specifically considering that for a lot of young African-American males, those images, those media images, are often really problematic. And so when you're taking your cues on how to perform your masculinity as a young Black male from the kinds of images that you see in society, those that are created by Black people as well as those that are created against Black people, it becomes a really treacherous kind of place to play in. And so my work begins to unpack some of those ideas. So one example of that is a series that I did in 2010. It was a body of work called Hard to Death, where I was basically asking the question, when does self-preservation become self-destruction? And thinking about the ways in which oftentimes a lot of young Black men are taught to be really hard and really kind of defensive and unemotional, and you can't cry and boys don't cry and all these kinds of things. But how that idea of self-preservation ultimately can become a destructive mechanism where you're unable to emote, you're unable to express yourself, and it comes out in maybe more dangerous ways. And so in this body of work, I broke it up into a few different series, but one of those series is a series called Second Childhood, where I was commenting on the ways or commenting on this sort of intergenerational problem that I saw, where I was observing that a lot of older black men were looking at what the younger black men were doing and deciding that that was what was acceptable masculinity. And so you have a bunch of older men trying to do what the children are doing. And I thought that was quite ridiculous, right? So to comment on the silliness of that, I had my stylist dress me in children's clothes. And then I would pose and, you know, like these kind of hip hop poses and hard poses, but wearing these children's clothes to give you this idea of the discomfort and the uneasiness of what that looks like. So this piece is from that series. It's called WWSD and Why, which stands for What Would Scooby Do and Why. Another series from 2012 was called All That Glitters Ain't Goals. And this is the title piece from that series. This piece, you know, talked about, this series talked about the sort of excessiveness of like bling culture and, you know, how that becomes an aspiration to, you know, have all these shiny things, but they're not necessarily things that can really define you or really represent you in any kind of way. And so this body of work was further articulated through an album by the same title, All That Glitters Ain't Goals. And so when this exhibition was installed, next to the paintings would be a little QR code. And so as you were walking through checking out the artwork, you can scan the QR code and download the song that accompanies each piece and listen to it, you know, while you're looking at the work. And then there's also a series of music videos that go along with it as well. This piece also is the piece that was selected by the producers of the show Empire on Fox. And so it hangs on that show in the home of one of the characters on Empire. Further building from that series is another series that I did in 2014. And this piece, Chaining Day, is from that show. It was called Pursuit of Happiness. And this was installed in New York in 2014. And I know I'm kind of going fast right now. I feel like I'm boring you guys because I'm getting tired of talking. But this series, you know, was a deeper articulation of the ideas that were initially begun with the All That Glitters series. As was mentioned earlier, I'm represented by a gallery in Paris, France, and I do a show there about every other year. Last summer was my most recent exhibition there. It was called I Know Why the Caged Bird Blings. And, you know, it was really a kind of a meditation on, you know, again, thinking about the ways in which, you know, within Black culture, you know, especially when you're coming from a position of lack, you often overcompensate for that when you get to a point where you can have things. But that within that, there's also this sort of almost need to shine, to express yourself, to be beautiful, to be brilliant, and it manifests itself in many ways. And so to comment on that, I talked about the ways in which those kinds of things come from us, even when we're not trying. And so this piece, Eclosion, is from that series, I Know Why the Caged Bird Blings. And it was also inspired in part by listening to Kendrick Lamar's album To Pimp a Butterfly, which uses a very similar metaphor to what I was talking about with this idea about the caged bird blinging. You know, in the Maya Angelou poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she makes a comment that the caged bird sings because that's all it can do. In my work, the caged bird blings because it can't help it. It is beautiful and it shines from within even when it doesn't recognize that that's what it's doing. And so the final body of work that I wanted to talk about is one of the bodies of work that I continue to work with to this day. It's a series called Gravity, which is a double entendre. Gravity, in the ways that I'm using it, refers, of course, to the concept of gravity as in what goes up must come down, but it also refers to the term gravity as in, you know, something being grave and dire. And so this series came about as of my thinking about the ways in which we talk about Black masculinity. And so oftentimes, Black masculinity is described and couched in a language and in terms that are really desperate and, you know, self-deprecating and sad. We court these statistics that talk about, you know, the disproportionate imbalance in black male performance and, you know, the presence of black men in homes. And, you know, it's like everything about black masculinity is always coming from the position of something negative. And I began to think about that and think, and to question that and think, like, what if we talk to our black male youth differently? What if we talk to them about their potential as opposed to the threats that are pitted against them? Could they see themselves differently? Could they defy gravity? Could they jump up in the air and stay there, essentially? And you know, to express this, I began playing with the trend of sagging. You guys are familiar with sagging, yes, and I know a lot of people hate sagging, but I actually had to make a 180 in terms of my thinking about sagging, because you know, I began in my research at Emory, began thinking about fashion as a kind of socialized expression, and came across this notion called oppositional fashion. And oppositional fashion is this concept that dates back to the earliest iterations of, you know, so-called fashion, where, you know, you have your group of elite who dictate what the style should be and what's acceptable and what's decent, but then you will have a group that counters that and says, I don't want to look like you, I want to do something completely different and stand out. And so my thinking is that sagging in many ways extends that dialogue. That sagging is actually offensive, it's rude because it's meant to be, it's supposed to be, you know. In a world where black men are told to, like, dress a certain kind of way so that people will be comfortable with them, sagging says, I don't need your permission, I don't need your acceptability, I'm here, you have to recognize me and accept me for who I am. And so I'm not arguing that every kid walking down the street sagging his pants can make that argument, but it is something to consider and something to think about. And so to further this commentary that I'm having about this notion of gravity, I use sagging as a kind of visual allegory to talk about the challenges that face black men and the ways in which sagging kind of tethers you, you know, to a certain idea that you have to overcome and that you have to try to fight actively to resist. And so this exhibition, Gravity, continues to be work that I continue to work with as I challenge and think about black masculinity, but specifically think about black male youth and how images, media representation produces and contributes to the way young black men see themselves and their performance in the world. And with that, I say thank you. I always like to end my talks with this quote, one of my favorite quotes. In the future, historians will tell what happened, artists will tell how it felt. And this is really how I think about myself and how I think about my work. And it goes back to that first exhibition, that first experience, where I realized that, you know, I wanted to make art that meant something and that could do something. And so I continue to commit myself to creating work and to creating work that fosters a dialogue that will ultimately move us beyond where we are. So thank you.